Hello everyone, and welcome to the Guild Wars 2 Balance Philosophy livestream. I'm Cal CMC Cohen, Skills and Balance Lead, joined by professional bodybuilder and part-time game designer Roy Marks.
Howdy.
So today, first things first, this is not a balance preview stream. You know, if you're looking for patch notes here, that's not what we're really talking about. Josh was in here about 15 minutes ago asking for staff weaver buffs, but whether or not those happen, they won't be something that we talk about today. We're mostly going to be talking about a lot of philosophy ideas, like the things that we consider when we're designing skills, designing traits, balancing the game. What are the things that we're thinking about? That's what we're talking about today. No patch notes. We'll talk about those probably in a couple weeks from now. You have anything to add, Roy?
No, nothing really. We can just jump into it, I think.
All right, we can just hop into it. And one thing to note is that we will be posting the full document on the forums following this live stream. We're just going to talk through a lot of the primary points on the stream.
Right. Yeah, so make sure you go to the forums after so you can read through that, just like what we did with the patch notes at the end of the last preview stream.
Right. All right, so let's just hop into it.
All right.
First thing, these are kind of some of the things that we'll be talking about today. One thing to note is that with a philosophy, with this kind of philosophy document, is that this is very much a living document, and this is something that's going to evolve over time. People who have been playing the game since launch are familiar with the idea that the philosophy has changed over the years, and there's new information that always comes in, new data. We see how the game is evolving, and the philosophy will need to sometimes adapt to fill the needs of the game. And that's something that we'll be keeping a close eye on and definitely be communicating as we feel the need to make updates to the philosophy. But so this is basically the philosophy as we see it today. It is certainly subject to change, subject to evolve as we go through time.
Yeah, and something else that's probably good to note here is that, a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about today is, what our philosophy is that doesn't necessarily align with how the current game's balance is. And so that's something that we're going to be looking to, we're going to be getting to that point after numerous balance changes, after numerous balance updates. So as Cal said, it's a living document, it's a living philosophy, it's going to be changing, and we're trying to, align the balance in the game with our current philosophy goals. And
right.
Continue to
not something that's going to happen in one patch. It's not like the November balance update will rebalance the entire game to fit the philosophy. It's something that's going to be happening incrementally over time.
Yep, absolutely.
So let's just hop into the goals. And there's a couple quotes here that we will see throughout the PowerPoint with some quotes from the philosophy document. The first and most important goal of balance is not actually here, and that is that the game needs to be fun. Believe it or not, that is the most important thing that we consider when designing and balancing the game is fun. And it's not balance, because you can make a game that is very well balanced that is just not fun to play, and no one's going to play that game. So we need the game to be fun. We need the game to be fluid and fast-paced is this idea of Guild Wars 2 combat.
Yeah, and that's one of the strongest parts about the combat system in Guild Wars 2 is how fluid, the combat feels, and also, how much it allows for player skill expression and mastered mechanics in the game. And so, just like, we want the game to be as fun, feel as fun as it can, we want the combat to feel fluid, we want players to want to play the game and want to, get involved and interact with the combat system.
Right, and so a big component of that is kind of the idea of build diversity, having a diverse set of strategies and builds that you can play, because we have a lot of different players that have a lot of different preferred play styles, and we want to support as many of those as possible when we're designing a game, because we want players to be able to play something that they think is fun. And it's just more interesting if the more options that exist, the less likely that the meta is to kind of stagnate and establish itself as a small subset of build options are the only ones viable. That's something that we want to avoid. We want to increase the number of viable choices.
Yeah, and something that you will certainly notice that we touch upon a lot, and maybe even too much at some point, is that word diversity. We're going to be, really touching upon it throughout this stream and throughout the document that gets posted. As we talk about philosophy, as we talk about balance, diversity is something that's very, very important to balance and philosophy and how we look at the game, how we approach balance.
Absolutely. So I think the first kind of main topic we want to talk about after goals, which we talked about already, is the idea of build complexity and kind of the combat depth as well, because Guild Wars 2 combat, fast and fluid for sure. It's also very deep, and this is something that I love, and I know a lot of players love about Guild Wars combat, is just how deep the decision trees go. And I've been playing this game for over 10 years, and I'm still pretty mediocre. You just see like mistakes being made by players that have played for such a long time, because the depth is just, it is incredible. And like I think it's one of the greatest strengths of Guild Wars 2 combat, and that's something we want to explore and we want to make sure exists. We want to reward mastery of the game, right? There should be a significant value into mastering the mechanics and knowing what you're doing.
Right. Yeah. If a build requires a lot of mastery of the game, then it should also perform potentially a little bit stronger. And so that kind of ties into the next part, which is that as Kyle said, we want there to be that mastery of the game. We want there to be builds that allow for that really strong player skill expression. We also need to make sure that there are builds that are accessible to everybody and at every level.
Yeah, accessibility, very important. And that's kind of coming back to a bit on the diversity side, just having a broad set of options and viable picks for the players who are looking for a particular play style. And we want to make sure that those are viable. So we have the idea, things that have been talked about in the community a bit is the idea of like a lower intensity versus a higher intensity kind of play style for a build. And it's important to us that these kind of lower intensity builds do exist, and they should be having success. You should be able to play these in clear content, and they still need to have room to kind of build and reward mastery of the game. As you come in, maybe you come in as a new player, you're playing on a build that's a little bit less demanding because that's what you feel most successful on. But we still want to give you room to grow and improve and get rewarded for playing that build very well.
Right. And not only that build, but any other build that, again, you're kind of growing into or branching out to.
Basically, the gist of it is we want a certain minimum level of effectiveness to be much more accessible.
Yeah.
But we still want to have that depth and that gap of rewarding the mastery.
And a really big part of that is making sure that there is at least one low intensity build per profession. So you're not just having, you don't just have, if you want to play a low intensity build, you don't have to be kind of shoehorned into a specific class, into a specific profession. There should be options, and that's sort of tying into diversity a little bit. We want there to be options for everybody, and so it's really important that we are getting to low intensity builds across all professions, which right now we're not. And again, that's one of those goals we're moving towards.
Right, absolutely. And kind of in a similar vein, there's an idea of, like in a player versus player environment or a more competitive environment, that the meta at different levels is different. The monthly tournament is going to have a different meta than your ranked queue. And something that's really important for considering when balancing is that if there are problems at any of these levels, that is going to be something that is making the game less fun for that group of players. And it's important that any significant outliers are kind of brought back into line. And that's going to have some sweeping, cascading impact on kind of the rest of the game, but it's important that those major issues at any level are resolved. And we want to look for ways to compensate the kind of impacted levels that didn't necessarily deserve it, which is not always easy, but it's something that we definitely try to do. But the key thing is that we need to be solving these problems at every level.
Absolutely.
So the next thing we're going to kind of dive into is the idea of gameplay roles. And this is definitely a pretty major consideration with balance, is the idea of, well, what are the things that players are trying to do in a particular game mode? And we don't consider these to be really absolute, or these are the only way you can play, but they are things that have established themselves over the years and things that we see as reasonable gameplay choices that we want to consider when balancing. Should this elite spec be able to fill this role? What are the tools that you need to have a viable build in this capacity? But at the same time, we want to leave room for innovation. We want there to be space for players to do something different from these established roles. And so that's kind of a delicate balance of, how much do we want to make things fill these roles versus how much we want to leave room for innovation? How much do hybrid roles exist? There's a lot of considerations here, and basically the idea is we want that innovation to exist, but we do have the roles that are more established and are things that we consider a lot when balancing.
Yeah, and as we've said, these are roles that we're kind of thinking about with each game mode specifically. They might not be represented completely right now. Again, there's room for new roles to kind of come, and grow into the meta as well.
I think innovation is really the thing that I love to see with Guild Wars 2, whether it's in PvE or PvP. Seeing something new come up is awesome, and we really want to introduce tools that allow space for that innovation.
Yeah.
But we can kind of talk about some of the roles that we do consider when balancing the game at this point.
Yeah.
So we can start off with PvE. You want to talk about PvE, Roy?
Absolutely. So obviously we've got the 3 roles up on screen. And again, these are kind of the roles that we really think about, that are kind of represented right now, potential for more in the future, as we said. But of course, there's your damage dealers, there's your boon supports, and there's your healers. And so one of the the big things with PvE specifically, and this of course is considering both instance content and open world metas, world bosses, etc., is that maximizing damage output is kind of the priority in PvE, right? Where you're trying to finish that boss, finish that encounter in the fastest amount of time possible. And that might not always be the immediate goal right when you start out, but that is kind of the eventual sort of end goal of PvE, is to be able to finish that encounter, finish that boss at the highest amount of time, or fastest amount of time possible.
Yeah, and I think the other important thing, rather, I think it's interesting, but it's also important. The thing to talk about with roles is that within a single role, there should be room for different flavors of that role to exist. Like the way that a warrior fills a DPS role shouldn't be exactly identical to the way that an engineer fills a DPS role. We want there to be unique tools and just a different feeling to how these builds kind of have different strengths and weaknesses, but they should still fulfill the same role. We just don't want everything to be kind of a carbon copy of each other, but warrior feels like NG feels like guardian.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that these roles have different strengths, different weaknesses, and just feel different enough while still filling the same space.
I feel like there's a really good word for that. Is it diversity? Could be.
That's okay. That's a solid word.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, you want to talk about World v. World next?
Yeah, so
That's
moving
next our
on,
list.
World versus World roles. And so we've got a few roles, obviously, for World versus World, and they're a little bit more broad, and then they kind of break down into some sort of sub-roles in a way. But you got your supports, and so, of course, this is going to be your healing supports, your cleansing supports, as well as what we would kind of call utility, so they don't necessarily focus on healing or cleansing. They might focus on other things such as boon stripping, boon rip, CC, things along those lines. And then, of course, you got your damage dealers, and this can be considered both with range damage, melee damage, and of course power versus condition. Something that's pretty important to note with World versus World is when we look at World versus World, a lot of the time we're focusing on obviously how fights play out. We're not really thinking so much about the game mode specifically with World versus World in terms of class and skill design and balance. Fights are really what we're looking at, and a lot of the times we're going to be specifying or specifically looking at large-scale fights. So when you have the most amount of players together. But of course, we're always keeping in mind that there's many different ways to play World versus World. It's a very, very diverse game mode, excuse me. And there's obviously always ways and room to make sure that we're considering small-scale fights, roaming, etc. When it comes to World versus World. But apart from just the roles, one of the most important things to consider with World versus World, and we talked about boons a little bit with PvE. And
we should probably go back because you're going to talk about stability real quick here, right?
I'm going to talk about stability.
Yeah. So something we didn't quite touch on in the PvE section is kind of the most important DPS boons.
Right.
Because obviously you want might, you want fury. Quickness and alacrity are kind of, we talk about stability is very important for World v. World. Quickness and alacrity are kind of in that same vein for PvE groups, and those are the things you want to really maximize uptime for. Though quickness and alacrity specifically are kind of things that we've identified as kind of subsets of that boon support role, and we don't really want to build that can provide high uptime of quickness and high uptime of alacrity because that has historically shown to be a dominant build type, and that's something you'll just always play it over the single alacrity, single DP.
Right. There should be reasons to take different builds, right? You should be able to take a quickness build, you should be able to take an alacrity build. You should probably not be taking a build that is doing both of those better than anything else.
Right.
And
that
just allows
totally
for
interrupted your train of thought there, but
that's
stability,
okay.
World v. World.
No problem. I'll try to get back on track there. But yes, so as with quickness and alacrity sort of for PvE, stability is going to be a little bit more key for World versus World specifically. Obviously, stability is still very important for PvE, for PvP, but stability we've seen in the past, when there isn't enough access to it, when there isn't good access to it, it really can very much affect how playing World versus World feels. And we feel that when stability is a little bit more accessible, when it's easier to get that access, when it's more spread out, the game mode and the gameplay feels a lot healthier. And so it's really important that when we think about these classes, when we're looking at roles, we want to make sure that there are healthy roles that are in the metagame that are providing this boon in a good and accessible way.
Right, and we still want to be able to interact with stability. It shouldn't be the case that you have 100% stability uptime.
Right.
But spreading the wealth of stability access is something that we started with the October update and we'll probably continue to do because, again, we want a diverse set of choices instead of Guardian kind of dominating the show in World v. World, on the stability side at least.
Absolutely.
So next up, we can talk about PvP. I guess I'll talk about PvP since Roy's been doing some heavy lifting.
Yeah, I've never
in
even
more
done
ways
PvP,
than one.
So. Well, there you go.
Yeah, so PvP, obviously we see a few more roles here, and that's really due to the nature of conquest. The nature of, a 3-node map. There's value in having that 1v1 side noder. There's value in having the roamer, the higher mobility character that can roam around the map. So there is a bit more nuance to roles than we've seen maybe in PvP and Movie World, but it's still a very similar concept where you have a support character, you have damage dealers, you have maybe a bruiser who's a bit less damaging, more survivable. But over the years, we've kind of seen different compositions exist as well. We've seen the more team fight oriented comp that's more about the support of the DPS. We've seen more split oriented comps around mobility or bruisers. And ideally, I think both of these different playstyles is viable, and there's space for even more playstyles to exist within player versus player. And so we do want all of these roles to have their spot. It shouldn't be the case that the game is dominated by the support. But obviously support their allies, keep them alive, give some boons. There's some nuance between like more offensive or defensive supports, again, getting that different flavor within the same role. We've seen, maybe sometimes the warrior support is a bit more aggressive. It gives more quickness and more personal damage compared to the guardian that gives more stability and more Aegis, that type of thing. But still, team fight supports, keeping up their DPS, which is more of the greedy damage dealers, I like to call them, because they give up a little bit of self-survivability, less self-sustain, they have a bit more hard mitigation, but they're going to die with 2 pressure over time. Then you see the bruiser is kind of a variant almost. It's going to trade out a bunch of damage for its own self-survivability. Then PvP roles are really interesting because there's a lot of choices that you can make with your traits or your utility skills to kind of flex between these roles, where a bruiser can go a little bit more offensive, lean a bit more toward that team fight damage dealer, but have more CC and a little bit more survivability, or you can flex more into the side node, be more of that 1v1 character. We're still going to see like the dedicated side node role, the dedicated DPS or the dedicated bruiser be kind of the best of that role, but there's a lot of room for these roles to flex and really give a lot of honestly depth of rotations in how you move your players around the map when you're playing PvP, which is really pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. A little bit more of a diversity there, I would say, in some of the roles for PvP. Again, just keeping in mind that the game mode itself is really influencing some of those roles as well, more so than maybe the other two.
Yeah, and as always, we'll probably reiterate this over and over and over. We want different builds of the same role to have a different feeling. Like the Thief Roamer should feel a bit different from the Revenant Roamer, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So next up, I think we're going to talk about some design guidelines.
Yeah.
I hope I called them design guidelines. Yeah, basically. I mean, it's not on the slide, but these are a few high-level ideas that we do think about when we're, again, designing and balancing skills and traits. Purity of purpose. Some people might have heard that before.
Once or twice.
Yeah, because it's an engineer trait.
Yeah.
But it's also an important, really one of the most important philosophy ideas. And then we'll talk about holes and roles, power budget. We'll get to these. Let's just start with purity of purpose.
Yeah, absolutely.
And really, purity of purpose is the idea that skills and traits should have a well-defined identity. What is the purpose of this skill? The purpose is to deal damage, so it deals damage. And if its goal is to deal damage, it shouldn't have as much defensive value. It shouldn't really be more of a crowd control skill or a high mobility skill or a team support skill. And this is really important because with the goal of making a diverse set of choices, we need to make sure that the identity of each individual piece is different enough. If I want more offense, I take the offensive utility skill. But if that skill also is a good defensive option at the same time, that just becomes a best in slot. You're never going to take anything else. And it reduces diversity to have a less defined identity a lot of the time. And we still have cases where skills will be, some damage, some not CC, because at least in competitive, we don't want damage in CC. But a little bit of damage and a little bit of healing on the same skill. That's something we'll talk about with power budget, where there is space for those kind of hybrid skills to exist, but we don't want the identity to be too wide. We still want it to be fairly contained.
Yeah, and sort of segueing into the next sort of broader guideline, obviously purity purpose is really kind of talking about and focusing on skills, but you can kind of tie that in as well to classes. And then, as I said, it kind of ties into the next part, which is holes in roles, which kind of is a little bit of a broader thing, very similar to purity purpose, but it's kind of looking at the broader sort of build level idea, which is that just like with skills, a build should be specializing in something, but then it still also needs to have a weakness. It shouldn't be able to be your highest damage dealer and your highest healer at the same time.
Right, and Really, that's the key. Like establishing unique strengths and weaknesses and holes. Like the idea of holes and roles is that there's builds or professions or elite specializations that have things that they just cannot do. And we don't want it to be the case that you can always access everything, because we want there to be kind of a unique feel between elite specs and between professions. But having the unique or the distinct strengths and weaknesses, again, gives us space for that diversity to really exist, because you're looking for something that, brings a better specialization, and maybe one of your DPS characters can bring more might to kind of splash some might generation into your party. That's valuable if the rest of your party is not bringing that might. But if you already have might covered, you might go for something with a different strength. And that just, and again, enables kind of different compositions to be built if the different builds and the different roles all have different strengths and weaknesses and holes. And that's really the key of holes and roles.
Yeah.
So next up, we're going to talk a little bit about power budget. And Roy actually prepared a fun metaphor for this.
Oh my goodness, putting me on the spot here. You're right. So think about if you went to a carnival and you play the different carnival games. You're better at some than others, I suppose. And then you end up, at the end, you have 100 tickets for prizes. And so you head over to the prize booth, and there's a prize that you want, and it's 50 tickets. And so obviously you can get it, you have 100 tickets, that's great. But now you only have 50 tickets left over. So you would no longer be able to then purchase a prize that costs 60 tickets, for instance.
That's great.
Or 3 that cost 20 each. Some quick maths.
That's some solid math and
Yeah.
a good metaphor. We talked a little bit about finding the right metaphor. Really, the key of
right,
power
what's
budget.
yours?
No, the key idea of power budget is basically there's an opportunity cost to anything that you do when building a skill, building a trait. There's something you have to give up to get something else. And obviously Roy's example with carnival tickets. If I'm building a skill, I have 100 tickets to build that skill. If I want that skill to have a 2.0 damage multiplier, that costs a certain amount of tickets to get that, which means I only have a certain amount left in order to give, whether we want some defense on there, or we want to apply a boon or mobility or whatever. This is the idea that if skills and traits all have similar power budgets, then we can balance the overall power level by keeping it fairly similar. And the way that we spend these budgets is going to be different. We obviously still want to respect purity of purpose. We don't want to go too wide, but there is opportunity to go and do a few different things less effectively than there is to do one thing very well. When we're talking about designing a weapon, the budget is kind of considered over the entire weapon, because you have these 3 or 5 or any number of skills that are all going to be there when you equip a weapon. And so we can take some budget away from one skill and give a little bit more power to a skill that we want to be like more iconic or more weapon defining, essentially.
Right.
And one other key point here is that longer cooldown skills are typically more powerful, so you do kind of gain budget by increasing the cooldown of a skill, but we still want it to be the case that similar skills in similar buckets kind of have these similar power levels, again with the overall goal of making a diverse set of choices.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's up next? We can talk about counterplay.
Counterplay,
That's a good one.
And yeah, this is obviously going to be very important. It ties a little bit into what we mentioned at the beginning, which is that obviously the game should feel fun. Fluidity of combat is going to be very important. And so the best example of counterplay is the thing that every single class has, which is the ability to dodge. And so dodge is at its very base level. It's a counterplay to pretty much anything, right? You can dodge damage, you can dodge a CC, you can dodge boon strip, whatever it might be. And so, the idea that exists is very, very important. We want there to be counterplay in the game. We want players to be able to feel as though they have options. They have, ways to interact with whatever it is, the other player that they're fighting or the boss that they're fighting is doing. And so, we want the counterplay to exist throughout the entire game.
Right, and this really comes back to the idea that we talked about earlier about combat depth. And the depth of Guild Wars 2 really comes from the broad number of decisions that you have at any given point of how you want to interact with what your opponent is doing or what the boss is doing. Obviously, dodge is kind of the more universal, I can use this to avoid any type of skill, whereas a block kind of loses to unblockable. Boons are interacted with by boon removal. So there's all the different tools with kind of the different ways that they interact, and making sure that those interactions exist creates the options to then make the depth of combat to make the decisions more interesting.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking about counterplay, we're talking about interaction. We want to make sure that the way that players kind of interact with each other is done in a healthy way, in a way that you can react. And so we try to avoid, like, one example here is we try to avoid instant skills that just do a ton of damage. We want the more deliberate animation tied to these. We want you to be able to react with a dodge or a block, or make the decision to take that skill, take that damage. You shouldn't just feel as if you are instantly dying because damage is coming at you instantly.
Yeah, and of course, there's going to be a couple exceptions. There are going to be some instant skills that do damage, but as Cal said, they shouldn't be able to, 100-0 you. They shouldn't be able to be those, really big, sort of iconic skills that deal a ton of damage, that you're relying on a lot of damage for. So most of the time, instant skills are going to be defensive abilities.
Definitely. I think that's pretty much all we have to talk about counterplay. Not, pretty quick, but also very important.
Yeah.
The last thing on this list is kind of this is just another way to say diversity, but the idea of minimizing bad build choices.
Yeah. And so this really comes into, making sure that a lot of skills, or really every skill, is going to be viable in some case. And so, right now, ideally what we're going to have is that every skill on, let's say every utility skill on Warrior is going to be viable at least in one of the 3 game modes, right? PvE, PvP, or World versus World. It might not be the case that it's viable, all of the skills are viable in PvP, all the skills are viable in World versus World. But as long as there's an option there for every skill, that's what we consider good. And right now, maybe that's not where we are. That's kind of what we're trying to move to. And obviously, very, very far off, in a perfect ideal world, every skill is going to be viable in every game mode. That will take a lot more time. That will be something that we're really moving towards.
Yeah, ideally that's where we get to, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Real quick, I wanted to add one more thing about the kind of the bad choices, because the way I kind of think about this is that there are bad choices which are just objectively bad. You never want to use this skill. There's also wrong choices, which is the idea that as a warrior, I can equip an axe, and that's a good thing. I can equip an axe and deal a lot of damage. But if I equip condition damage stats with that axe, it's not going to go well for me. And this really isn't something that we need to fix on the balance side or the design side, because both condition damage stats and warrior axe are viable choices. They just don't work well together. And with any game that's, delves into this kind of deck building space, this multiple build option space, there's always going to be the opportunity to make these kind of non-synergistic decisions. And that's not something that we can realistically avoid. And it's not something we try to avoid, because as long as these pieces are viable in their their actual use cases, that is what we're trying to get to.
Right, and so that's really what it comes into play when talking about minimizing the bad choices versus the wrong choices.
Yeah.
Wrong choices are going to exist. That's just the reality. The less bad choices that exist, the better. And ideally, there just won't be bad choices.
Right, and so coming back to the kind of the noble goal of every skill and trait is viable in every game mode, that's very difficult, because every game mode is very different, and the things that you care about in PvE are different from the things you care about in PvP. So in order to kind of make these skills more effective in multiple game modes at once, we've started down the road of skill splits. This is something that players should be pretty familiar with, because we've been doing them for quite a while. It started off as a system that would just change the effectiveness of a skill between different game modes. A skill would deal damage, it could deal more damage in PvE, less damage in PvP. That's a way that we could kind of balance the skill between different game modes with their different things they care about. But at the same time, we've kind of seen the limitations of this system over the years, and that there are definitely cases where certain functionalities are healthy in PvE and definitely not healthy in competitive modes.
Right.
And so we've kind of expanded the skill split system to encompass these more functional changes. They're not things we want to do that frequently, but not given the opportunity, but in the case that we need them, we are comfortable with making these changes. The important thing is that we need to maintain the identity of a skill.
Right.
So a defensive skill is always going to be a defensive skill in PvE and PvP and World versus World, but the way that this skill provides its defense may be slightly different. It may be Aegis versus Protection. And this is a way that we can kind of take these skills and make them more valuable in different game modes without affecting the game modes where they already feel good. And that is kind of where we can really try to maximize the value of these skills in every game mode. Every skill, every trait could be viable in every game mode as we utilize kind of these more functional splits.
Yeah, it gives us a lot more options. It gives us a lot more flexibility when, again, keeping in mind the goal that we're trying to make, minimize bad choices, remove bad choices, get all these skills, viable in at least a game mode. And so, obviously, utilizing skill splits is something we're going to, potentially rely on heavily in some cases.
Absolutely. So I think that's pretty much all we have to talk about with skill splits. Next up is a very important topic in design, and this is something that we've been kind of working on a lot more heavily recently, and we've been trying to improve our feedback processes and how do we get feedback from players, because getting feedback from players it's very important.
Yeah.
And internally, we design things and we play test and we iterate, and there's a lot of people internally that do play the game a lot, and we bounce a bunch of ideas off each other. But the amount of testing that we do internally is kind of immediately dwarfed by the live game. As soon as basically within like an hour or two of the live game, we have now gathered more data. And so getting that wider look and getting the insights from more people, even before we go live, is something that's super important, and it's something we've started to do more with the previews. And it's just something that allows us to get essentially more data, because we do make a lot of decisions based off data, and we have a lot of internal metrics for every game mode, and we do use those to kind of drive some decisions, but player feedback is just as important. And if I could kind of go back to what is the planning phase of a balance update, what does it look like? It kind of starts with us establishing the goals that we have for an update. What are the things we want to look at? Are there anything that doesn't line up with the philosophy right now that we're trying to bring in line? Beyond that, so we kind of establish our own goals, and then we're going to also be looking at internal data. We're going to be looking at player feedback to identify kind of some common pain points and see that those are also things that we should be adding to this update.
Right.
So even in the planning phase, player feedback is super important.
Right.
We'll be reading the forums, we'll be watching some streams, looking at various social media channels to get kind of multiple points of view.
Yeah. And then, of course, after the planning phase is the preview phase, which we saw with the last balance preview.
Somewhere in the middle, we build the content and we make the changes. But then, yes, we do.
After the planning phase, then yes, we preview what we've built. Exactly. There
exactly.
You go. Sort of took that for granted. But yes, the preview phase, and so that is where obviously we're going to be looking for the most amount of feedback on what we're showing. And where we're really going to be looking at that that player feedback that we receive for the previews that we show.
Right, and really the important thing is every change that gets to the preview phase is there for a reason, and we always have some underlying goal for what the change is trying to accomplish. So when we have a change that is maybe received a bit less positively, it's important for us to kind of take a look at what the primary feedback points are, and if there's a way we can solve the problem in a different way, because there's numerous ways that you can approach any problem to get to the same goal. And we obviously pick a direction during the development phase with how we want to solve a particular problem. But when this doesn't align with maybe the community feedback, it's important to reevaluate. And it doesn't necessarily mean we always change something based off feedback, but it's important for us to go back, look at the goal, see what's going on here, and kind of try to pick out the pain points of the feedback and identify, are there changes that we can make so we're still accomplishing our goal while also kind of making the change feel good for as many players as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really important for us to note that the feedback up until now, and previously, has been really useful. And so the more feedback we can get, the better. And so if you do give feedback or you don't give feedback, make sure you continue to give feedback. And again, it's very, very helpful for us. It's one of the best assets we have when it comes to determining balance. And so it's the more the better.
Yeah, and I think one final note I'll touch on kind of for the preview phase is the idea of mechanics versus numbers. And obviously we preview the whole patch and, well, whatever's ready for the preview. We've seen, last time we had a few changes come in a little bit late that didn't quite make it into the text preview. But the point is, the most important changes that we want to get feedback on are kind of the mechanical reworks. And there's obviously a lot of numbers changes that are included in a preview that we also want to get the general feel of, but those can be a little bit harder to kind of get a feel for without actually playing. And it's definitely the case that sometimes the number is just completely wrong. And it's like, oh, well, that number doesn't make any sense. You need to change that. But a lot of the time, we do want to get some live gameplay data with how some of these number changes feel. And the main thing that we're looking at during the preview phase is look at these mechanical changes. What do you think? Do these make sense? What are the problems with this design? Again, because we're solving a problem in a particular way, and we want to see what kind of the sentiment around that solution is.
Most of the time, if there's a change that is mechanical versus just numerical, it's going to have a wider impact, a bigger impact, and that impact is going to be felt a lot stronger. And so that's why it's really important for us to make sure that we're getting as much feedback as possible on those mechanical changes versus just the numbers changes. And of course, we still want the feedback on the numbers changes. We still want to be able to preview those when available, but the mechanical changes are really the ones that we are focused on in terms of getting that feedback. They're the priority there.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, we could talk about player feedback for a really long time.
Yeah.
Like it's impossible to understate how valuable feedback is to the design process. So basically, as Roy said, we really appreciate everyone who gives feedback. And I get, no, that's not really important. I was going to make a joke about, I get so many direct messages on the forums or Discord, but
most of them are from me.
Yeah, unfortunately, I do get a lot of messages from Roy about balance.
But you don't answer me all the time though.
Definitely not. I rarely answer Roy actually. The point is, I really appreciate this, and I do, we don't really have the time to respond to every bit of feedback that is sent our way, but we do read a very, very large percentage of the forums and the messages that are sent to us directly, because having more data, having more feedback is just always good.
That's really the purpose of these previews, right, is to make it easier and make it more accessible to get that feedback, so yeah.
Yeah, so again, we could talk about this for a long time, but the gist of it is, we love feedback, please give more feedback. Very much appreciated.
What a great summation.
Yeah. But I think moving on is actually to the wrap-up. That's kind of the last main thing that we were going to talk about. We've actually been blazing through this. It's always interesting when we're doing these, because we do rehearsals during the week, because no one trusts Roy and I to just hop on a stream and riff about balance for an hour. But we do kind of fumble through a little bit, figuring out the right words, figuring out the right things we want to say during these kind of couple of rehearsals. And so we've kind of been whittling down the time just because it's a lot smoother for the final product.
Yeah.
So that's very impressive. I don't really have much to add. We're basically into the wrap-up
We
phase.
could just go back and do it all over again.
Yeah, we could just run through it again. Yeah. But realistically, we're just going to wrap it up here. Obviously, a pretty quick stream. This is a summary. This is basically a summary of the balance philosophy, and these are things we consider, and these are things that we... Obviously, there's a lot of specifics that we didn't talk about, because that's the thing where we'll get a bit more into it during previews. As we talk about balance updates, we'll talk about here are the specific changes that we're making, and here are the specific reasons why we're making these changes. And a lot of those will call back to like, hey, purity of purpose, or holes in roles. These are why we're making these adjustments to this particular class, because it doesn't have enough holes, or it doesn't have defined weaknesses. But that list, we would be here for all day. You could probably talk about the specifics of things that we would change for 24 hours straight. And,
at least 24 hours
we could take up the whole extra live stream
Yeah,
next
we
week,
could.
but we're not going to. Obviously,
I think
we're just here to
upset if we did
talk
that.
about high-level ideas. We'll post the philosophy doc on the forums. You guys can all hop in there, give us some feedback, give us your thoughts. What is missing, if anything? What do you think?
Yeah.
Because again, these are kind of the general high-level things that we think about when we're designing the game, when we're balancing the game.
Yeah. And just a couple of key points to kind of mention, as we wrap up. Obviously we talked a lot about diversity. We mentioned at the beginning of this stream that this is a living document. It is something that is going to change in the future, and it is something we're really trying to push the balance of the game to align with the goals we've discussed and the goals that will be present in that document that gets posted to the forums. So, obviously just a good thing to keep in mind, and something that obviously is very present in our minds when we're looking at game balance. And with this philosophy.
Definitely, like as we said, there's a lot of things that don't necessarily align with the philosophy, and those will be priorities, but they won't be things that we get to all of them immediately.
Right, yeah, that takes time.
Yep, takes time.
Yeah.
So we can really just wrap it up. We'll be back in a couple weeks to talk about the November balance update.
This is the point where he tries to do the outro for a while and stumbles around.
Oh, I always fumble through the outro, so we're just going to do it miserably and horribly. And balance update preview in 2 weeks.
There you go, that's one.
There's that. Extra Life is in 1 week.
That starts a week from today. It starts at the same time that this stream started at, which is 12.
37 minutes
PST.
ago, 1 week from now, Extra Life will be starting. Roy and I will be doing a segment. We'll also be back with Ray. I don't know if anyone remembers Ray. He's obviously not here, but
I'm not sure who that
there
is.
may be some head shaving involved if the price is right.
Yes.
And obviously, great cause. We're here for charity.
It is a really good event. It's a 24-hour stream. There's going to be a lot of great people on there. There's going to be a lot of great activities. It's definitely a good cause to support as well. It's a fun interactive stream, so make sure you come and check it out. And you have 24 hours to do so. So definitely a good time to be there. We will be there if you haven't gotten enough of us.
In the last few weeks, and then we'll be back in the following week. There's 3 weeks in a row that we'll be on stream.
That's probably too much. I don't know how we keep getting away with this, but.
All right, I think we fumbled through the outro long enough. I'm probably going to get like an angry message from somebody after this. They'll be like, oh, that was the worst outro I've ever seen. Anyway, we're wrapping it up here.
Bad.
We have a Halloween party to get to.
Yes, I'm in my costume, if anyone
I'm not in my costume.
wasn't able to tell.
But yeah, so we're going to go to a party, and we're going to be posting the document. Please read it. Please give us some feedback.
Yeah.
Obviously, we'll be back. And I'm going to stop saying the exact same things over and over and over because we're just going to end the stream.